Hello and welcome to Colour Multimedia Enterprises. My name is Luke, also known as Tianery, and I am going to be showing you StoryDev 2, or at least I'm going to be developing StoryDev 2 behind the scenes from scratch. Well, not from scratch, but using C# and the .NET framework to build a visual editor for Haxe applications. So not from scratch. Take back what I said about that. Not from scratch. I've been watching too much Handmade Hero, so every time I watch the introduction of that, I keep hearing, we're going to be making a game from scratch, and I just have that in my head, and yeah. We're not making it from scratch. That's a project that's completely different. But StoryDev 2 is a visual editor designed for creating user interfaces for OpenFL and perhaps other things as well. So this is going to be completely different from what I'm doing behind the scenes, if that makes sense. So effectively what's going to happen is, for those of you who want to contribute to the project, you probably want to know exactly how the code base works from the ground up. So I'm going to be doing a series of videos from day one. So this is day one of StoryDev 2, and I will be going through all of the code as I'm coding, showing you exactly how it all works, and basically creating the project, each individual one of them, until it obviously works. Now, because it's going to be done pretty much from scratch, if that makes sense. Not from scratch in the sense that we're not going to be using anything except a programming language, no libraries, whatever. What I really mean by that is we're going to be creating the canvas, the graphics, components that allow us to drag and drop stuff around on the screen. The ability to click on them and interact with them, have selection modifiers and all that sort of stuff. We're going to be doing all of that, plus more, edit history, all of it. And the idea is to show you exactly how it all works, as I mentioned. And that means that I'll be using my own code as reference, because I know that all of the code that I've committed to the GitHub works. So I am going to create a project in Visual Studio, not in C++, in C#, and I am going to create a Windows Forms application, .NET Framework 4.5, and I am going to put it in a different folder. I am going to put it in my USB, which isn't actually plugged in. Hang on a minute. I've got my USB here on keys. Right, let's put that in. That should detect soon, hopefully, in your own time. There we go. Right, so let's go into here. Don't scan, I didn't want it. I'm going to go into projects. We've got a StoryDev 2 thing here, and I'm going to get rid of all of that because I don't need that. So let's delete. Yeah. Yes, in your own time. Don't need any of this anymore. Why is it taking so long? You know what? Delete it from here. I'll select this. I'll get rid of that bit there, and I am going to call it StoryDev 2, and the actual project is just going to be called SD2. Okay. Now there's two different projects in the, or rather three, in the repository. Now the two main ones, SD2 an SD2 API. So SD2 is basically the Windows Forms application, and SD2 API is the reusable DLL where we can use it for creating extensions, which is primarily what that API is used for. But I'm not going to be going into that too much just yet. What I basically want to do is just get a canvas up and running on the screen so that we can start drawing graphics, which is obviously one of the most important parts of StoryDev 2, the ability to drag and drop user interfaces. So let's just set all these things up a bit, and I want that to be in the center screen. I always like having the window start in the center of the screen. I really don't know why. Okay, so let's put in a menu. So we're going to need this. Just going to put in an insert menu here and put in an object. So basically when we click on that, we just add something onto the canvas, which we haven't done yet. So let's go ahead and create a new file. It's just going to be a class. Wait, no, it's not. It's going to be a user control. And it's going to be called canvas.cs. And inside that canvas, we are not going to do anything with that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a few styles and a few other things. Now, I can't do a list with the iDrawable because that's going to be part of a different project. But first of all, before I do that, there is a function called setStyle, which allows us to set certain flags. Now, the reason why we need to do this is because we want things like double buffering in order to prevent flickering, right? Because if we were to use the paint event without those styles, it would cause flickering and it just looks horrible, right? So we want to prevent that from doing that so that we don't end up with that. So let me just go into here a moment so that I know what I'm doing. Right, so there are 4 flags that we need. There's control styles, so that control styles is an enum, and we want this one, all painting in WM Paint. So we're going to set that to true. We're going to set another one, control styles. There's another one called double buffer, which obviously enables double buffering. Double buffer. Optimize double buffer. What? What are you talking about? What? There should be a double. No. Okay, hang on. Buffer. It says optimize double buffer. Huh. Interesting. Oh. I wonder what version I'm actually using in the actual project itself. I might be using a different version of the framework. Hang on. Can't really go ahead and do this project without knowing what the framework. Oh, I am using the same target framework. What the? That's weird. Why is it I can use double buffer, control styles.double buffer, which does in fact exist? Am I missing something? I don't think I'm missing any usings, so no, I'm not. That is really weird because there is definitely double buffer, just like that. It's not erroring out. What? Why doesn't IntelliSense pick that up? I really don't know why. Never mind. Anyway, so we know it works. Anyway, we know it works. Another thing that we need is control styles, and in this one we are going to get supports transparent back color. The reason why we want that is because, for example, we add some bitmaps which has transparency in it, so that we can get that working properly. Control styles, and last by no means least, control styles, when I can finally type, user paint. And this one basically tells the control to paint instead of the actual operating system. So we set all those flags, and then that will allow us to basically draw things on the screen. Now, before I go ahead and add anything else, I'm going to need to add the second project, which is SD2 API. The reason why is because, as I mentioned, SD2 API is the DLL file that accompanies StoryDev 2 that allows people to effectively basically just create extensions to make it easier to do that. I'm going to add system.drawing and system.windows.forms because that will be necessary for it. Actually, I don't believe we do need Windows Forms, but I put it there anyway just in case. So what I'm going to do is GDI objects, which is basically all of the objects that we're going to be using in our canvas. So what I'm also going to add is interfaces, which are also necessary. Now the reason we add interfaces, and that should actually be so the reason why we need interfaces is because we want the people who create extensions to be able to talk to the canvas. If we had, for example, if we were to, let's say, make it public void, I don't know, sorry, public list even, and then you'd have GDI object, for example, which is what we will implement in a minute. If we had that, then what would happen is the people who wanted to create extensions that extends from GDI object, they're basically restricted to the virtual functions that are available in those objects, which isn't necessary. The reason why you have this iDrawable concept is because A, we can make it easier to do function calls. It's easier to cast. It's not as expensive on the CPU, I believe, than it is to cast to an actual class, an object. So interfaces are cheaper. That's about it, really. I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know the full ins and outs of exactly how things work in the memory and stuff like that. So if you want tutorials on how memory works and stuff like that, I'm not exactly the kind of person who would be able to teach you on that. But I can definitely, of course, teach you on actual programming principles, at least, to a certain extent. So, in this canvas, we are going to add some GDI objects to it. But before I go ahead and do that, I need to create a class which is going to be a GTI object, and that is going to take an iDrawable. Right, now inside the iDrawable, if we go back into here, all I'm going to do is say void draw. That's going to take a system.drawing.graphics, because that's what we need. So drawing like that, and then I'm just going to pass in graphics here. Oops. The reason why we need that is because, let me increase the size of that so that you can see it, and myself as well. Now the reason why we're doing this is because we can just simply call that function, and we will pass in the graphics from the paint event args inside our canvas. When we go back to here, when we come to implement it, we just say public virtual void draw, and then graphics G. I need to actually add that namespace again using system.drawing like that. So what we need to do now is basically add some properties so that we can actually access certain things. So what I'm going to add is some integers that will be the location, and so public virtual int x and y, and the size, which of course is going to be width and height. Public virtual int height. Fairly self-explanatory. Now there's also things like instance name and instance type. I'm not going to include those just yet because they're not really important right now. What I'm also going to include is public virtual color. We're going to have a fill color. Now I've actually used the British spelling here, and then I use the American spelling in other places, which is really inconsistent. I should just stick with the American spelling, to be honest, just to make things a bit easier, but never mind. Public virtual void outline color. Now when we go ahead and draw this, what we want to do is basically just simply draw some rectangles, right? And that's what we want to do. Now there's two different methods that allow you to draw rectangles. There's the draw rectangle call, which basically just draws an outline of a rectangle. It doesn't actually create a rectangle. So all I'm going to do is pass in the outline color there, and then a new rectangle for the next one, and then I'm just going to pass in x, y with height, like that, and I can finally type. And then there's the other method, which is fill rectangle, which actually fills a rectangle. Now, need to be a bit careful about this one because it needs to be solid brush, because when we come to actually filling the rectangle, we want the outline to actually show, right? So what we want to make sure is that we offset the filled rectangle by 1. So the best way to do that is just to add 1 to the x and y and minus 1 to the width and height. It is quite literally as simple as that. We can add a thickness to the pen if we wanted to, but I decided against that because I felt that wasn't really necessary. I might add it at some point, it might be necessary. But apart from that, that's all we really need. Now there is also a constructor, which might also be necessary just to make sure that this works the first time we create it. So constructor looks like this. Now I'm going to leave the parent bit out because we don't need that right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the outline color, let's say black to start with. The fill color can be white to start with, color.white. I'm going to set the width and the height to 100 and the X and Y 0. Quite simple as that. Okay, so now that we've done that and we've got this eye drawable thing here, what I'm going to do is go back to my canvas. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, I need to add a reference to my project. So I need to add that SD2 API so that I can use it. And up here, are you going to work? Thank you. Up here, add that, and then I am going to put in a private list of iDrawable, and then that's going to be objects. So the reason why we put that there is because we want to basically have the ability to add objects to the canvas. When we do that, we invalidate so that everything on the canvas is drawn. Now what I'm going to do is go back to the design, click on the electric icon thing, or lightning icon, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to scroll down to paint and double click it so that it generates this event handler here. And in this event handler, all I want to do is iterate through all of these objects and draw them, right? So it's just a case of for each var obj in objects, and I am just going to say obj.draw and then pass in that e.graphics, and then it's just going to draw everything that's there. So how are we going to test that? Well, first of all, what I need to do is somehow create an object and add it to that object list. Now it is private, so I am going to need to create a function probably called create object, pass in iDrawable, and in here all I want to do is just say objects dot add drawable, and I'm going to say invalidate. Invalidate is basically going to force the control to repaint, and then it will do that, and then it will call that event handler as you might expect. So what I'm going to do is build the project, because obviously in order to get that canvas to show up in our toolbox we need to build it first. Let me just drag this up so that we can see what's going on. There's no errors, so that's all good. What I'm going to do is go into here. I'm going to go up. It's finally appeared, and I am going to drag that canvas onto here. Just going to dock that to fill. When I go ahead and click on this, double click on it, all I'm going to do is say canvas1 dot create object. There's a create object function here, and that will allow us to pass in a new drawable object. So all I'm going to do is say I need to do using SD2 API so that I can access those GDI objects. Then I'm just going to pass in a new GDI object. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to test. So let's take a look. So we've got this canvas here, which we can't actually see because everything is just grey. So if we click on that, it now appears. We can't do anything with it. We can't drag it. We can't drag it or anything like that. So that's going to be the next thing that I'm going to implement. So there's nothing particularly special yet. I'm just going to go back into here and get this underway. So I'm going to add a few more things that will allow us to do drag and drop. So first of all, first things first, I am going to add a public object selected object. Now the reason why it's public is because we will be able to access that later to get that object and put it into a property box so that we can modify it. And obviously when we modify the values in that property box, we want to invalidate the canvas so that the effects of that object take effect immediately. Again, it's also important that we have this because then we will also be able to identify what our selected object is so that we can move it around on the screen. Right. So now that we've got that, we also need to add a few other private variables which are going to be necessary. So I am going to pass in a point, which is going to be the previous mouse location. Now the previous mouse location is going to store the mouse location when we first click down on this control. So we want to store that previous mouse location because that's going to be necessary. We've also got another iDrawable, which is going to be previous selected object. The reason why we have this is because let me just double check this just to make sure I'm actually talking sense. Let's see. Am I actually using it? Right, yeah. So basically the reason why we have the previous selected object is because we want to check to see if that previous selected object was in fact that selected object that we stored in here, right? Because this is an object, this could be anything, this could be any class and any type. So we want to basically check to see if that selected object variable is in fact the previously selected object so that we can identify where our previous mouse location will be, right? And then we do a few other things there as well. So let's go ahead and add that last private variable. So let me just drag up in my other project. So this last private variable is going to be mouse down. The reason why we have this is because we're going to have also a mouse move event handler, which is going to determine whether or not the mouse is down. And if the mouse is down, then and we've got an object that's selected, then obviously we want to move that selected object. So let's go back in here. I'm going to generate a few handlers. So the first one, so let's take a look. So the first one is going to be mouse click, which will give us the ability to click on objects. Next one is going to be mouse move. So let's go back down here. Mouse move. Back over here again. There's a few more. There's also mouse down and mouse up. Mouse down and mouse up. Okay. Now, what we've got is a utility function that allows us to get an object at a specific point. And we need that in order to actually get an object. So what I'm going to do is add this method somewhere in this code base. I'll put it down here. And I am going to return an object, and it's going to be get object at point, and we want to pass in a point, and we basically want to iterate through every single object that we have. Now the reason we're returning a GDI object instead of an iDrawable is because we want to actually get the object itself that we want to actually modify instead of the interface that applies to that object, if that makes sense. So there's also a concept called GDI object container, which I'm not going to actually add in this just yet, because we don't have that. So all I'm really going to do is say var casted GDI object. So we're just going to cast to a GDI object inside that object, inside of this object here, because everything is an iDrawable, if you remember. So we need to cast it first. Now the reason why this works is because GDI object applies the iDrawable interface. If this object class didn't apply it, then it wouldn't work. So if I got rid of this and show you, that should, oh right, yeah, because it's not a compile time feature, never mind. I thought it was a compile time feature, never mind. But anyway, at runtime that wouldn't work because GDI object is not a what was I going to say? It's not an iDrawable. That's what I was going to say. So what we want to do is we pass in whatever the point it is, and then we check to see where everything is basically. So p.y is greater than casted.y. So we want to make sure that the point is within this object. Now, one thing to note is that this goes in the order of from the top of the list in objects all the way to the bottom. So if we have an object that's further down the list, anything that's rendered later is obviously going to overlap whatever is going to be before that item. So if I had two rectangles that overlap each other, right, and I click on a specific point, the object that's actually going to return is not the object, it's not the overlapping object, it's actually the object before it. Now, at first I thought, actually, that doesn't sound right. But then I thought, actually, you know what? That actually makes quite a bit of sense, because perhaps you might actually want to access objects behind the object that you wouldn't otherwise click on. Now, the reason why I kept that feature in there is because, well, perhaps what if you want to click on an object that's behind an object that's invisible, right? Because you can't see it. Which means that you can then move it around and actually be able to modify it. And that's actually one of the reasons why I implemented it like that. To give that functionality. I didn't want to do it the other way, simply because of that reason. So this needs to be p.x actually, which is going to be less than that. But yeah, anyway, so let's go ahead and implement these things. Plus casted.height. So if that point is within that object, we're just going to return that object. We want to return the casted, not the actual object itself, because obviously that's otherwise it's going to return back the eye drawable, and we don't want that. We want the actual object itself. If we don't find anything, then we're just going to return null. So now that we've implemented that function, we can now apply it to our events. So what I'm going to do is, in the click event, I am going to get that object. So get object at that point. I'm going to pass in e.location, because there's a mouse click is going to have that. We're going to check to see if it's not null, because if it's null, then obviously we don't really want to be doing anything. So what I'm now going to do is just say selected objects is equal to obj, and the previous selected object is also going to be equal to obj. Otherwise, I am going to say selected objects is equal to null, and then I'm going to invalidate. Not that we really need to put that there anyway. So we get that object, and then we check to see if we then move. So we're gonna do the objects. We're gonna get the object again if we move. I'm gonna pass in e.location once again, and we're going to check to see if it's null or not. If it isn't null, what we want to do is check to see if mouse is down and the selected object is not null. So first of all, what we want the user to do is we want the user to actually click on the object explicitly to tell the canvas to say, okay, we've now selected an object. We now want that object to move if the mouse on the canvas moves, and as long as the mouse button is down as well. So now that we've got that, what I also want to do is show a cursor. So I'm gonna change the cursor type to cursors to all, size all even. Now in here, what I want to do is get that selected object, cast it over to GDI object so that we can actually obviously modify it accordingly. And what I'm going to do is I am going to say that the current point that this new location of the mouse is going to minus the previous mouse location that we eventually set in mouse down. Then we're going to say e.y minus previous mouse location dot y. Oops. Can you work, please? Talking to my hands. Invalidate. So again, we're forcing the repaint so that the actual modifications take effect. Now, if there is no object, we want to change the cursor back to the default. So cursor is .default. Oops, default, like that. Right. So in mouse down, what I want to do is check to see if that previous object, that previous selected object, oops, is not the selected object. Now again, we need to cast that so that we can make sure it works properly. Now the reason we want to do this is because we want to set the previous mouse location if the previous selected object is not the currently selected object. Why do we want to do that? If we click down to start with and we select an object, right? We want to set the previous mouse location to a new point. And that new point is basically the point that is relative to the current cursor location and the location of the object that we are about to select, right? Now, if, for example, we then select another object, right, and it's not the same one, then we want to set a new previous mouse location, because otherwise we'll end up dragging the same object, if that makes sense, right? So we want to make sure that the previous selected object is not the same as the current one. Otherwise, if we then mouse down again and move the cursor, we will actually end up moving the same object that we had previously selected, which is not what we want to do, right? If that makes sense. So what we're going to do is, once again, cast that selected object over. I'm then going to get this previous mouse location, and I'm going to pass in a new point. And as I mentioned, it's going to be relative to the location of our object. So it's going to be e.x minus object.x, which is the location of our objects, and then e.y minus obj.y. Right. If we do select the same object, then we put in this else statement here, and all we want to do is put in, if previous mouse location is equal to point.empty, then we just want to say previous mouse location is equal to e.location, right? The reason why we do that is because if we click down and we select the same object, we just want to store the previous mouse location to the current location of our mouse. And then we say mouse down is equal to true in order for the mouse move event to work properly. And on mouse up, what we want to do is just simply previous selected object is going to be equal to null. Previous mouse location is going to be point.empty. And then we'll say mouse down is equal to false. Right. That's all we're going to do for now. So now, what I'm going to do is test it and make sure we can actually drag that object that we can insert. So let's go back to our main form. Still got this insert menu, that was a bit of a glitch. So let's start, make sure everything's all good, which it is. So let's say we insert that object, so now when I hover over it, actually, you can't see the cursor, can you? Because I hid the cursor. Oh dear. But anyway, I can drag this object around the screen. It's not flickering, which is all good, right? If I were to go into the canvas and go up to here and comment all this out, then what will happen is when I click on that and I drag it around, you can see it flickering, right? And that doesn't look good. It's not flickering that madly. Okay, well, when you drag it that rapidly, it does flicker quite a lot. But that's an example of flickering, which you don't want. So you want that. You want those styles to apply so that that flickering doesn't, so that it doesn't flicker. Now the good news is that on, I believe, since Windows 8, the .NET framework has been upgraded with GDI Plus to allow for hardware acceleration. Operating systems before that, I believe, do not have hardware acceleration, so GDI Plus isn't as good on Windows 7 or earlier, as far as I'm concerned. That's what I heard. I could be completely making that up, but I believe that's what I heard at some point. I'm going to stop here because I've been going on for quite a while now. It's been 45 minutes, so I am going to stop. I hope you've learned something, perhaps, maybe. In the next video, what I'm going to be doing is going over the grid and some snapping options and stuff like that, and basically polishing up this canvas, perhaps adding some more GDI objects as well to add things like text and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.